So, in this unboxing, we're going to take a look at both of the Beatles' UK album box sets that were originally released in 2009, the mono and stereo set. So we'll start with the mono set, which comes in this white slipcase. It used to have a hype sheet on the back, but I did not receive this. I bought a used copy on eBay, and then we just have the Beatles in mono printed on the spine. Pull it out, we have a second part to the slipcase, and each of the individual albums is packaged in miniature LP style, and they each are wrapped in a resealable plastic bag. So we'll start with the booklet, which has an essay by Kevin Howlett on the importance of these mono albums, as well as notes for the Mono Masters CD, which are very similar to the notes for past Masters, which we'll see in the stereo box set, and we'll also see a lot of these same pictures, but it is a beautiful booklet nonetheless with some very helpful notes about the importance of the mono albums. We also get a dedicated credits page for each album with all the current publishing information, or at least current as of 2009. I believe it's been updated once again since. I won't unpack each of these individually, but I will do a couple. So, as I said, these are replicas of the original LP releases, and these truly are very beautifully detailed. So here we have the first album, Please Please Me. On these earlier records, we actually have these fold-over flaps over a matte back black and white card, which is exactly how they would have been released in England in the 60s. So these are truly very accurate to the original packages. Right on down to the inner sleeve, which replicates the original inner sleeve that would have come with those British albums. So that is Please Please Me. We have With the Beatles, the second album. I will say the color temperature on this seems a bit off. It does seem like their faces are kind of just floating. You can't see their full silhouette. We have A Hard Day's Night. We have Beatles for Sale, which is a gatefold jacket, but I will not open that for right now. We have Help. We have Rubber Soul. We have Revolver. We have Sgt. Pepper, and I will go ahead and open this up because not only did they replicate the folds on the gatefold, but they also included a miniature version of the original pull-out insert with cardboard cutouts, which was included with the original, as well as replicated the original red inner sleeve. So that's quite beautiful. And Magical Mystery Tour. This is actually a replica of the original Capitol release, since this was initially an American album and then was later released in Britain, but initially all the Magical Mystery Tour songs were released on an EP in Britain. They were released on an LP in Capitol, and so they actually do replicate what a Capitol LP would have looked like at that time, with some very thick cardstock wrapped in white, and then the cover is actually a sticker on top of that cardstock, which is exactly how LPs of that time period would have been packaged. And we have a replica of the original booklet that was included in both the EP and in full 12-inch size in the Capitol version. So beautiful little booklet with a comic strip of the storyline from the movie, as well as lots of photos. And on the disc, we actually do get a Capitol label as well, since this is replicating the US album. And lastly, we have the white album, which replicates the original British release, which had top openings instead of side openings. And of course, we do get the fold-out poster, reproduced in miniature size. It also did include all of the 4 glossy photographs of each member that were included in the original as well, but those are not in here because I have they're being displayed at my house at the moment. And then we have Mono Masters, which is the new compilation here, which is very similar to past masters with just a few track list alterations. So there is the mono box set. Truly beautiful packaging. Now we have the even bigger and more luxurious stereo box set. So on the outside we have a list of contents. This is a slip cover which comes off, and the box has a magnetic clasp on it which opens like so. And then we have ribbons to pull out the individual digipack releases. So we have Please Please Me. These all, except for the White Album, come in a trifold digipack. Each has a new booklet that reproduces the original cover notes if that album had them, which Please Please Me does, as well as each booklet includes historical notes and recording notes, which some details on some of the recording techniques that were used, as well as the context of the album in the Beatles' entire catalog. So here we have With the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, Beatles for Sale, Help. This version was made from the 1987 CD stereo mix that George Martin did. The original stereo mix is included as bonus tracks on the mono CD in that box set, and the same is true of Rubber Soul. This is the 1987 stereo mix. We have Revolver. We have Sgt. Pepper, which has a beautiful booklet which reproduces the lyrics. This includes probably more notes than any other of the other releases, some historical notes, some track creation notes, notes on the cover, including this diagram which shows exactly who all the people on the cover are. And then in the back we have all of the lyrics reproduced. Magical Mystery Tour also has quite a thick booklet, and this does again reproduce that booklet that would have come with the original LP in addition to new notes. The White Album is the one that is different. It gets a slightly different package. It gets this O card, and then we get a fourfold digipack. So we get the photos on the inside. Inside the booklet we get all of the lyrics reproduced as well as historical notes. And then we do get, once again, that fold-out poster. This is slightly different than the one in the mono box set because it's glossy instead of just matte paper. And it also says CD1 and CD2 on it instead of sides 1, 2, 3, and 4, which the original would have had. We have the Yellow Submarine album. We have Abbey Road. We have Let It Be. We have Past Masters, the booklet of which is very similar to the one that came with the mono box set. And then lastly we have the mini documentaries DVD. So each of the albums gets a little 5-minute mini doc with some dialogue from the Beatles and George Martin included, some nice photos, and each of the individual mini documentaries is also included on the original albums because all of these except Past Masters are enhanced CDs. You can put these into a computer and watch the mini documentaries as QuickTime files. I'm not sure if those are still supported on more modern PCs, but they certainly were when I first bought this. So that's the mono and stereo box sets. Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. I'm Brandon Ware. You're watching Angel65, my channel for all things music related, my own music posts as well as music reviews. Today this is chapter 2 of the Beatles Deep Dive, where I will be looking at the 2009 mono and stereo remaster box sets by the Beatles. I'd like to start this episode off with a story. When I was a young kid, probably 10, 11 years old, when these box sets were fairly new. I think they'd been out for a couple years at that point, and by this point in my Beatles journey I had heard 5 of the albums. I had heard the White Album, Sgt. Pepper, Abbey Road, Let It Be, and then I had Past Masters, all released separately. Then I decided that I wanted to get all of them in one hit and listen to all of the music at the same time. So I decided I was going to spend my summer allowance from doing chores on the Beatles stereo box set, which at that time I still remember I paid about $180 for, which seems to be about the same price it still tends to go for most of the time. I wanted to buy the stereo box set because I had already heard some of the stereo remasters and I was super impressed with the packaging. I liked that they each came with a little mini documentary. I had actually seen all of the mini documentaries because I checked out the mini documentaries DVD from a public library and watched it, so I wanted to own my own copy of that. And it has all of the albums, which the mono box set does not. But my brother and I had worked out a deal that with his summer allowance, which was less than mine because he did less chores than I did, he would buy the mono box set, which at that point was retailing for around $100. He seemed super excited by it at the start of the summer. He loved the packaging. He certainly wasn't as big of a fan of the Beatles as I was, but he definitely enjoyed their music, and so he was convinced that he wanted to buy the mono box set because he loved the little mini LP style packaging that it had. Therefore, we could both listen to each other's CDs and hear everything in mono and stereo. Well, by the end of the summer, he had changed his mind, and he decided to spend his $100 on an iPod Touch Gen 9, I think it was. So that bumped me out a little bit, and at the time I was very mean about it to him, but in the end, I think, he just wasn't bound to become as big of a Beatles fan as I did. So for most of my childhood, the stereo remasters are what I had to listen to. Those are the remasters I grew up with, and that is how I was introduced to the majority of the Beatles catalog, save for some LP releases on Capitol of some of the original Capitol albums, which, as I mentioned in Chapter 1, I owned and then later sold, especially after I got this box set, which has everything in it and uses the unaltered original UK masters. Those are the sources they are remastered from. I did not get the mono box set until about 4 years ago. I paid a collector's price for it of about $120, I believe, as it was in very good condition, and after years and years of being stuck with the stereo remasters, I wanted to hear the mono masters as well. So when I had a Beatles kick about 4 years ago, I decided to buy that. What have I learned since owning both of the box sets? Well, this begs the question, why listen to mono over stereo, and which of the two box sets is a better deal? As the essay in the mono box sets discusses, the Beatles themselves were far more involved with the mono mixes on every album up to and including the White Album, because mono was still the dominant format. Stereo records had existed since the late 50s, but these were really for audiophile listeners and people of higher brow music taste, if you like. It was very unlikely that a lot of pop fans would be buying mono records because they would not be listening to these things on super high quality audiophile equipment or even modest equipment. I mean, it's important to consider that particularly in the first half of their career, the majority of people buying the Beatles albums were teenagers, and they were listening on relatively cheap record players at home. So if given a choice between mono and stereo, mono was more readily available, it would sound correct on whatever gramophone you played it on, and it was probably cheaper. So for most of their actual career, their fans were listening to them in mono. This only changed at the end of their career once they mixed Abbey Road and Let It Be in stereo only. But the first 10 albums, the dominant mix is most likely the mono mix as far as most people are concerned. However, when the music was first transferred to CD, on all but the first 4 albums, the stereo mixes were used because those became more popular after the fact once stereo did take over and became the dominant format. Many of the stereo mixes were made months, sometimes even years after the fact by George Martin, and sometimes even George Martin wasn't there. So in many cases, the stereo mixes did not have the approval or the acknowledgement of the Beatles or George Martin at all. And yet those are the mixes that since the 70s have become more popular and are what most people are used to. The mono mixes are generally, certainly up until Sgt. Pepper, more pleasurable to listen to just for the sake of listening, because the stereo mixes were all created from, on the first 8 albums, 4-track tape, and then by the time of Magical Mystery Tour, they were working with 8-track tape. But even with 8 tracks, there was still a lot of limitations as to how things could be panned using the stereo spectrum. As the recording notes in the stereo box set also discuss, many times they were recording multiple instruments to a single track on the tape. So very often bass, drums, and guitar would all be recorded to a single track. So when you're panning that in a stereo field, that means you're going to have bass, rhythm, guitar, and drums all on one side of the mix, if that's how you choose to do it, because those instruments, until very recently with the Revolver remix and the Red and Blue album remixes, could not be separated. That is just how it was, and that is both an indication of how genius the Beatles were and also an indication of the limitations of the time and the fact that mono was not a priority for them. That said, the stereo mixes are what I grew up listening to, so those are what I'm more used to. After going back to them, particularly the early albums, for the first time in probably 10 years it's been since I've listened to the first 6 albums in stereo, the original mixes. It has been fascinating because on the one hand, it's not as pleasurable to listen to because of the way stuff is panned. Particularly the first 2 albums were recorded on twin track tape, so all of the instruments are in the left, and with the few exceptions, all of the vocals are on the right, which on headphones is a very unpleasing experience. It is not pleasant to listen to. On my stereo system, I have 2.1, so I have 2 speakers plus a very decent subwoofer. So on the things where the bass is panned hard left or hard right, having a subwoofer kind of accommodates that and makes it less noticeable that the bass is panned hard to one side. After hearing the mono mixes, I have to say, for the first 6 albums, certainly, I prefer the mono mixes to the stereo mixes, and even over the stereo and help remixes, which are what are included in the stereo box set. I still prefer the mono mixes, although, as I mentioned in the unboxing, the mono box set has both the mono and the original 1965 stereo mixes of both Help and Rubber Soul, because the stereo box set uses the 87 CD mixes. In general, I would say mono is preferable, and this is especially true of Sgt. Pepper. I grew up with the stereo version of Sgt. Pepper, so when I heard the mono version and read the notes by Kevin Howlett about some of the choices that were made and the differences between the 2 mixes, and finally heard the mono mix for myself, I was astounded how much better it is than the stereo mix and just how different it is. It's not that the songs are all missing things, although in some cases they are, but just the overall tonal quality of the record was completely different to the stereo mix that I grew up listening to. And I always liked Sgt. Pepper and revered it for how important it was to recording history, but I gotta say, my respect for it increased tenfold when I heard that mono mix. I was blown away by how much better it sounded and how synthesized everything was, and just how well it illustrates the innovations they were using with 4-track tape. It's truly outstanding stuff. Some additional notes for the mono set. So on the Mono Masters CD, which is effectively the mono version of past Masters, it is missing Ballad of John and Yoko, Old Brown Shoe, and Let It Be, because those were not included, those were never mixed in mono. In their place, however, you have the 4 tracks, the new tracks from the Yellow Submarine album, which are It's Only a Northern Song, All Together Now, Hey Bulldog, and It's All Too Much, because on the original Yellow Submarine album, it was released in mono and in stereo in the UK, but the mono mix was actually just a fold down of the stereo mixes. This is indicated in the Mono Masters book and in the Yellow Submarine booklet in the stereo box set that the stereo version of It's All Too Much was actually a fake duophonic stereo version, because they created an 8-track tape machine by having 2 4-track tape machines together, but when mixing, the problem is, are both tapes going to start at exactly the same time so that you can mix it down to stereo? Unfortunately, only the mono mix was completed, but ironically, the stereo mix was what was released and then recombined into a fold-down mono mix for the fold-down mono LP. So the mono mix of It's Only a Northern Song, as well as the other 3 songs, are unique to the Mono Masters box set, as they had never been previously heard before. And those are also very, very fascinating, although I do think Yellow Submarine sounds fine in stereo. On the stereo Yellow Submarine CD, it does include the full, complete mono mix of It's Only a Northern Song. It does not have the fake stereo mix because, again, a true stereo mix was never completed at the time. So that is a slight alteration of CDs and LPs of Yellow Submarine that would have come before. And of course the mono box set is also missing the full Yellow Submarine album, so it doesn't have the orchestral stuff by George Martin that was on the B-side, as that was never mixed in stereo. And it does not have Let It Be or Abbey Road, because neither of those albums were ever mixed in mono either. So in terms of which box set is more complete, well, the stereo box set has everything. It has all 13 albums plus past masters, which has all of the tracks that were either on singles or EPs, or in the case of Across the Universe, the alternate version, a charity album, the stuff that never made it onto the final British albums. So if you want everything in one hit, plus some really nice packaging with recording notes, plus the mini documentaries, which were really my visual introduction to the Beatles, and hearing them speak for themselves about their catalog, this is well before I had heard Anthology or anything like that, then the stereo box set is obviously a better buy, with the addendum that it's not as pleasurable to listen to, particularly in the case of the first 6 albums, because of the way things are panned. However, I have a deep emotional attachment to this box set. It was always one of my prized possessions growing up. I've always really, really enjoyed it. And honestly, I find the stereo mixes fascinating, particularly with everything that was recorded on 4-track, because you really get an indication of just how genius they were. And these recording notes, when I read those as a kid, that's how I learned how to record. I learned how to do multi-track recording by reading the notes in the stereo box set. That is how I learned what multi-track tape was, how to record multiple layers, and that's what I learned what bouncing is. For those of you that don't know, bouncing is the process of, if they were recording on 4-track tape and they used all 4 tracks and they still needed to add more layers, more overdubs, then they would copy to a second tape and mix stuff together to leave free tracks on the second tape so that they could do more overdubs. When I first got an 8-track portable recorder from a teacher in high school, I knew how to use it because I read the notes in that box set. All I had to do was look at the user manual to figure out how to control it, but I didn't actually have to learn what multi-tracking was and how to bounce tracks and what bouncing meant, because I already knew how to do that. So I have a deep, deep, deep attachment to this stereo box set, and those notes I find fascinating, because they explain in depth how the tracks were created, and it gives you an indication of just how innovative the Beatles were with their use of 4-track tape machines, to the point where by the Sgt. Pepper album they were bouncing 3-4 times, which in the case of the sound quality means that you're losing sound quality each time, because analog to analog transfer is of course not a perfect transfer, especially when you're mixing stuff together. But at the same time, the level of genius that these guys employed is just mind-boggling. And being able to predict what the final mix would look like as you're bouncing your tracks is just, it's genius. And it really is a strong indication of why these guys were so important and why what they did lasts to this day. Particularly from Revolver onward. I mean, the quality of those recordings is just outstanding. The mixes, particularly the stereo mixes, may sound dated, but they don't, the music itself just holds up so well. And listening to all the layers, in mono you get a better sense of what their intention was, how it was supposed to sound, how everything is supposed to meld together into a cohesive picture. But in the stereo mixes, especially on headphones, you can really pinpoint how they used the multi-track tape machine to achieve what they were doing. It provides maybe a less enjoyable overall listening experience, but it provides a greater indication of how they were working and what it was like to be in the studio with them. It's just fascinating stuff. Plus you get all 14 albums, which you do not get in the mono box set. So between the two of them, which do I recommend more? Well, I have to recommend the stereo set because the packaging is beautiful. The mini documentaries are really cool, and you get every single album. The mono box set, however, if you can still find this and pick it up, I highly, highly recommend it, because not only is the packaging of this beautiful with the mini LPs, which are reproduced just beautifully, but the mono mixes of particularly the first 6 albums are much improved according to this, much improved over the stereo mix, and I would argue that they are pretty necessary to hear. especially Sgt. Pepper. The mono version of Sgt. Pepper is absolutely mandatory listening. I am not sure if you can listen to both versions on streaming. I haven't looked because I'm not much of a streamer. I collect these things because I like sitting down and listening to them and looking at stuff while I listen to music. I like it to be an overall comprehensive experience. That's not to comment on the pros or cons of streaming or the sound quality or anything like that. It's never been my thing. I've never been a music streamer. When it became popular and all my friends did it, I just didn't follow along. I just wasn't interested in it. Anyway, the point I'm making is I don't know if you can get the mono version outside of this set. If you can stream the mono version because you want to buy the stereo set and don't have enough money for both of these, then definitely check out the mono version. But if you can afford it and find this for a reasonable price, then I highly recommend this, because hearing the things in mono is pretty much essential if you want to hear more of what the Beatles themselves heard when they did playbacks and exactly what they were going for. But the stereo box set is the better value for money because you get visual material, you get notes, and you get all the albums. So between the two of them, if you can only get one, I have to recommend the stereo over the mono box set. I really have always had a deep appreciation for this, but I am certainly glad that after 10 years of wanting it, I finally did pick up the mono box set and learned exactly what it was that makes them so different and in many cases superior. So they are both certainly worth having in my opinion, but the stereo box set is the better value for money. Okay, so that covers all of the original albums. In terms of my favorite albums, I'll wait to add more commentary till I get to the Super Deluxe sets at the end of this series, because I'll be covering each of those albums in depth. But when it comes to their whole career, as I said in Chapter 1, it is pretty much essential that you listen to every album start to finish, the UK versions, to hear exactly how much they grew and how much their songwriting and recording techniques progressed from record to record. That said, if you're not going to listen to all of them, the essential releases and the stereo remasters that are probably most worth picking up as standalones out of that set, pretty much everything from Help onward is absolutely essential. Help, Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, White Album, Abbey Road, and Let It Be. All of those are essential. And Past Masters is only essential if you don't have any of the compilations, because it includes many of the same hit singles that are on the Red and Blue and One compilations, plus some other interesting stuff that was B-sides, etc. But really, the 7 albums between Help and Let It Be, excluding Yellow Submarine, are all essential, and they are some of the greatest and most important records ever made. That's my thoughts on it. I would love to hear your comments. Feel free to comment specifically about which albums you like, which mixes you like better. But as I said, I'll go into more detail about individual albums once I get to the end of this series. This is more of just a general overview of which set is of better value and which one you might want to pick up more. Alright, that's all for now. Let me know your comments below. Thanks.